In the final weeks of his life, Pope Francis issued one chilling warning aimed at one woman, Queen Camilla. He didn't name her directly, but insiders knew exactly who he meant. And now, everything he predicted is happening. Pope Francis passed, away at the age of 88, his body weakened by illness, but his spirit more determined than ever. As his health faded, his words became heavier, loaded with meaning that cut deeper than doctrine. He spoke not of politics or policy, but of deception, masks worn by those in power, and palaces hiding silent betrayals. His tone shifted, his language sharpened, and Vatican officials, some shaken, admitted in hushed tones he was speaking about the British monarchy. More specifically, Queen Camilla. Behind the grandeur of the papal chambers, a quiet storm was brewing. The man once known for embracing everyone from world leaders to the poor began to retreat, especially from one royal figure whose past had long raised moral red flags. He had once offered subtle approval to King Charles's transition, but something changed. Meetings were delayed, blessings were withheld, and with every passing month, Pope Francis appeared to draw a distinct line, one that separated true service from false sanctity. Those close to him recognized the signs. The Pope, though frail, had grown bold in his spiritual warnings. In one homily, he spoke of a woman who ascended not by grace, but by silence, a veiled reference that sent ripples through the inner circles of the Church. He warned of crowns forged not in duty, but in denial. And while most brushed off these messages as poetic caution, a few Vatican insiders knew better. These were not riddles. These were revelations. He had seen something, heard something, and whatever it was, it shook his trust in the public image being projected by the modern royal family, particularly the woman who had once been a scandal and now wore the crown. While the media spun stories of unity and reform, the Pope saw through the illusion. He didn't just question the monarchy's spiritual direction, he feared its influence. What the world missed in his final addresses was the gravity of what he was trying to say. This was no general sermon about morality. It was a direct, strategic message to those in power, those who had forgotten that crowns do not excuse corruption. The Pope was issuing a final plea to listen, before it was too late. But what Camilla didn't know was that the Vatican had been quietly watching her for years. Long before the world paid attention, long before the Pope's final warning echoed across headlines, a secret file had already been opened, one that would quietly shadow Queen Camilla's rise for nearly 2 decades. It wasn't made public. It wasn't shared with diplomats. It was kept within the innermost walls of the Vatican, shielded from the press and locked under layers of silence. And at the center of it was Camilla. The Vatican doesn't open confidential dossiers lightly. For centuries, they've been reserved for cases that challenge not just politics, but morality. That's what made this file different. It wasn't about scandal for scandal's sake. It was about the spiritual integrity of someone who had suddenly become the face of the monarchy. From the moment Camilla's role in the royal family began to solidify in the early 2000s, concerns started quietly building in Rome. Not because of tabloid rumors, but because of something far more subtle, her growing influence behind palace gates. Internal memos uncovered years later revealed that Vatican officials flagged her rising prominence as unprecedented and unexplained. Her charities, while outwardly noble, had links that raised questions. Donors with histories of offshore finances, events co-hosted by controversial foreign players, and, perhaps most troubling, Camilla's increasing access to global religious leaders without formal endorsement. For a woman who had once been condemned as the other woman in a royal affair, her transformation into a spiritual representative of the crown struck many in the Church as deeply problematic. Correspondence between senior UK clergy and Vatican envoys around 2005, just before Camilla and Charles wed, paints a tense picture. While the Church of England moved to normalize the marriage, whispers in Rome remained defiant. Several Vatican bishops believed the union undermined public trust in royal morality. Pope John Paul II had already expressed discomfort with the relationship. And while Francis never openly opposed it, He quietly began requesting updates specifically focused on what he called the moral symbolism of monarchy. That's when the file began to grow. Slowly, quietly. With reports cataloging everything from unexplained financial inflows into her patronages to curious diplomatic invites she received without official royal sanction. Each piece of information, on its own, could be explained away, but together they formed a pattern, one that hinted at something far more complex than ceremonial royal duties. By 2018, red flags had turned into full investigations, internal, unofficial, and heavily classified. The Vatican's Office for Interfaith Relations began monitoring her overseas visits, especially those involving religious institutions. And while nothing explosive had yet been uncovered, the file itself spoke volumes. It wasn't just a record. It was a warning, because for the Vatican, this wasn't about politics. It was about faith, representation, and the fear that the crown was being used to launder more than just image. It was being used to launder trust. And as the file grew thicker, so did the silence surrounding Camilla's public role. She was once the most controversial woman in Britain, and yet she became queen. But at what cost? Camilla's path to the throne was not a fairy tale. It was forged through whispers, judgment, and a nation's unwillingness to forget. To the public, she was never simply the other woman. She was the woman who shattered the most beloved royal romance in history. Her name became a symbol of betrayal the moment Princess Diana sat down and uttered those unforgettable words. There were 3 of us in this marriage. And from that moment on, Camilla's legacy was chained to a ghost she could never outrun. Even as the royal family tried to rehabilitate her image, the shadow of Diana loomed large. The nation hadn't healed. The grief that swept across Britain after Diana's tragic death in 1997 turned into something darker: resentment. That public pain didn't fade with time. It simmered. And when Charles eventually married Camilla in 2005, the royal image cracked again. Crowds didn't cheer, flags didn't wave. It was a coronation of duty, not love, and one that many believed should never have happened. The disapproval wasn't confined to the public. Pope John Paul II, then head of the Vatican, reportedly refused to offer a formal blessing over the union. It was a subtle move, but a powerful one. It spoke volumes. The Church, like the people, wasn't ready to embrace a queen who had built her place in the palace on the ruins of another woman's heartbreak. Even when Pope Francis took the mantle years later, the Vatican never fully endorsed the marriage. He softened the language. He extended grace, but he never extended full warmth. There was always distance, calculated, deliberate, and meaningful. And yet, despite the criticism, Camilla did rise, slowly, methodically, with palace advisors carefully crafting her every move. Her public role expanded. She took on patronages, smiled at state events, and posed beside Charles in a dozen orchestrated photographs. But the transformation wasn't organic. It was strategic. A makeover built on controlled narratives and quiet deals made behind closed doors. What she gained in title, she never quite earned in reverence. By the time the crown rested on her head, the palace had rewritten the story. She was no longer a controversial figure, but a devoted consort, a loyal wife, a queen in name and presence. But underneath the polished image, the resistance never fully faded. The silence in the crowd during her official proclamations, the carefully worded royal statements that praised her but never celebrated her, and the looming silence from Rome, even after her coronation. It all pointed to one unspoken truth. Hers was a reign accepted out of necessity, not embraced out of admiration. And when power finally came to her, the weight of secrets followed close behind. Camilla's connections run deep, but one link hidden for years made the Vatican take notice. It began with whispers untraceable at first, easily dismissed as coincidence. But as documents began to leak, a pattern emerged. Camilla, now queen, had long maintained associations with individuals whose reputations had raised alarms across both financial and religious institutions. One of those names stood out immediately: a global investor whose name had appeared years prior on a discreet Vatican blacklist for funding operations tied to corruption, exploitation, and laundering disguised as philanthropy. He had disappeared from public view, but re-emerged quietly. In events where Camilla was often a guest of honor, papal advisors grew uneasy. These weren't routine diplomatic events or standard royal engagements. They were curated gatherings, frequently closed to the public, where influence shifted behind velvet curtains. In 2019, at one such international summit disguised as a global women's initiative, Camilla appeared as a keynote speaker. But what Vatican observers noted wasn't the speech, it was the guest list. Several attendees, including the blacklisted financier, had histories of masking questionable ventures behind charity fronts. And Camilla's endorsement, even if symbolic, was all they needed to re-enter legitimacy's spotlight. That's when the Vatican began to look closer. What they found was far from comforting. Beneath the surface of noble causes and awareness campaigns lay something far murkier. Charities linked to Camilla's name, especially those operating abroad, were found to have minimal paper trails, inconsistent financial disclosures, and shell operations that shifted locations as quickly as they raised donations. None of it was provably illegal, but it was enough to raise one critical concern. Were royal titles being used to launder not just money, but morality? Within Vatican City, the tone changed. What was once distant caution turned into active concern. Advisors close to the Pope pressed for immediate scrutiny. The risk wasn't just reputational, it was spiritual. If a monarch, whose very title came with divine implication, was seen aligning, whether knowingly or not, with deceptive financial webs, it could erode the Church's moral authority by association, and, in the eyes of those who still believed monarchy, should walk hand in hand with faith. This was unforgivable. The real danger wasn't what was known, it was what was still hidden. Every document led to another unanswered question. Every donation raised another unspoken doubt. Camilla, already carrying the weight of a controversial past, now stood at the center of a storm that couldn't be spun by PR or silenced by tradition. Because this time, it wasn't the press watching her, it was Rome. And then came the first official move. Quiet, strategic, devastating. In 2023, during a state visit that would have defined a queen, Pope Francis made a bold decision. He declined a meeting. The visit had been planned for months, marked on calendars as a diplomatic gesture of unity between church and crown. King Charles and Queen Camilla were scheduled to meet with Pope Francis in what many believed would be a symbolic moment, a fresh start, an image of reconciliation between old institutions. But what unfolded behind the marble doors of the Vatican was anything but ordinary. When the royal couple arrived in Rome, everything appeared as expected, until it wasn't. Papal protocol was quietly rewritten. Only Charles was granted a private audience. Camilla, the newly crowned queen, was escorted to a lesser chamber, never once welcomed into the Pope's presence. There were no photographs, no public greeting, no formal blessing, just silence. An absence so loud, it echoed through diplomatic circles and sent shockwaves down corridors lined with centuries of tradition. The Vatican issued a statement, claiming the decision had been made due to illness. But insiders knew better. The Pope had been active just days prior. He had met with world leaders, addressed congregations, and even attended a mass celebrating interfaith dialogue. His health hadn't failed. His faith had been tested. Because behind those closed doors, the Pope had already spoken, not in public, but directly to Charles. According to leaked reports from high-ranking clergy, the Pope's words were careful but unyielding. Not all crowns shine with truth. It wasn't a denial. It was a warning. A quiet refusal to lend the Church's moral authority to someone whose rise remained mired in controversy, secrecy, and unresolved spiritual questions. To most of the world, the gesture was missed, buried, in headlines about royal fashion and formal speeches. But to those watching closely, it was clear. The silence was intentional. It was symbolic. In an institution built on ceremony and signs, this was the loudest rejection the Pope could give without ever raising his voice. And for Camilla, it was more than just an oversight. It was the unraveling of an illusion, one where every appearance, every title, every carefully framed photograph had been constructed to rewrite her legacy. But the Pope wouldn't play along. He didn't condemn her outright. He didn't spark scandal. He simply didn't show up. That absence became a turning point. In the weeks that followed, conversations inside the Vatican grew more intense. The file on Camilla, already thick, was now gaining attention from voices that had once stayed silent. Her presence in religious diplomacy had crossed an invisible line, and the Church, known for patience, was now quietly drawing boundaries. But while the world missed the signs, fate had something else in store. Months after the Pope's passing, the cracks began to show. And then came the headlines that rocked Buckingham Palace. It started as a whisper on international news wires, barely noticed at first. A report from Washington claimed the FBI had launched a quiet collaboration with UK intelligence agencies. The focus? Alleged financial irregularities involving overseas charities tied to members of the British royal family. But buried within the legal jargon and diplomatic disclaimers was one name that made Vatican insiders freeze Camilla. One of the operations under investigation traced directly to a Middle Eastern initiative Camilla had personally championed, a women's empowerment project lauded in the press, photographed for royal media, and praised at elite global summits. But beneath the glossy branding, investigators uncovered something else entirely. Large cash transfers, anonymous offshore accounts, and a tangled web of shell foundations connected to individuals long monitored by international watchdogs. What triggered the full-scale inquiry wasn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. It was a whistleblower from within the palace, an anonymous figure who'd had access to internal communications and financial summaries that had never been made public. They handed over documents that exposed far more than questionable donations. There were internal memos suggesting titles were being used to secure tax-exempt benefits abroad, unauthorized endorsements, mismatched records of Camilla's appearance fees. It wasn't just sloppiness, it was strategy. Digital forensics teams traced metadata from palace communications, uncovering email chains, edited PDFs, and deleted audit files that had been scrubbed just days after the Vatican had declined to meet Camilla. One particular email, redacted but recoverable, contained a chilling line from a royal advisor. "If Rome pulls away, we lose cover." That single sentence rewrote the timeline. The Pope's silence had come not out of caution, but out of knowledge. And then came the leak. Vatican insiders, no longer bound by silence after Pope Francis's death, confirmed what had been feared. The Holy See had kept a private file on Camilla's global engagements. One high-ranking cleric, speaking off-record, shared the Pope's words just weeks before his final public appearance. "They've turned grace into currency, and they will answer for it." Another simply said, "He warned them." The media storm exploded. Investigative reporters from both sides of the Atlantic began cross-referencing timelines. Patterns emerged, dates aligned, transactions that once looked benign now pulsed with red flags. Camilla's team issued vague denials. Royal spokespeople retreated into legal statements. And the Queen, once the picture of post-scandal recovery, found herself standing at the center of something far more dangerous than public opinion legal exposure, institutional backlash, and growing whispers that this wasn't just a political problem. Because what surfaced in the files wasn't only about money, it was about image, manipulation, and the weaponization of royalty, a sacred title repurposed for personal leverage. What the public saw as charity, the investigators now saw as a mechanism of control. And what the Pope had refused to bless was now unraveling in real time. But the most shocking part? It wasn't just about corruption, it was spiritual betrayal. To the world, she's queen. But to Pope Francis, she may have symbolized something far darker. Throughout his papacy, Francis championed the forgotten. He washed the feet of prisoners. He embraced the sick. He tore down walls between religions and spoke fiercely against moral hypocrisy. His reign wasn't marked by ceremony, it was marked by humility, mercy, and an unwavering demand for truth. So when it came to Camilla's ascension, His reaction wasn't rooted in protocol, it was rooted in conviction. Camilla's reign began not with cheers, but with questions. Her coronation was framed as a new chapter, but to many, it felt like the rewriting of an old story, one filled with betrayal, manipulation, and scandal. Her path to power hadn't been won through legacy or public devotion, it had been forged behind closed doors, sealed by decades of negotiation, and cemented in a crown that never quite fit. Every appearance she made, every speech she gave, carried. With it, the weight of a reputation never truly redeemed. The headlines were careful, the critics were hushed, but the tension was unmistakable. Within the Vatican, the unease was no longer quiet. Francis had begun to speak more openly, though always without names. He warned of leaders who wore crowns but lacked clarity. He spoke of spiritual erosion of faith being twisted to justify image, indulgence, and influence. And among those closest to him, it became clear. He feared that the monarchy, once seen as a moral compass for the nation, was veering off course. Its compass, he believed, was broken, and Camilla was at its center. He didn't call her evil. He didn't condemn her to the public. But in private, his language turned symbolic, haunting, even. According to one aide, he referred to her as the final test for Britain's moral identity. A test not just for the royal family, but for the people who had allowed a rewritten history to take root as truth. He questioned whether a nation that once stood for duty and service could now accept silence and scandal as leadership. And if they did, what did that mean for their soul? His final months were filled with reflection, but also urgency. His concern wasn't political, it was spiritual. He saw in Camilla not just a woman ascending the throne, but the manifestation of what happens when image wins over integrity, when titles are used to cleanse reputations instead of carry burdens. His warning to those who truly listened wasn't about monarchy, it was about morality. And he knew that history would either prove him wrong or vindicate every unspoken fear. And now, with the world watching, his warning is unfolding in real time. He's gone. But his message echoes louder than ever. Because what Pope Francis foresaw is no longer a warning. It's a reality. In the weeks following the Pope's death, the world entered a reckoning. News outlets ran wall-to-wall coverage of Queen Camilla's unraveling narrative, no longer shaped by royal press teams, but by journalists, governments, and global faith leaders asking the same question. How did this happen? What had been whispered in Vatican halls was now shouted on front pages. Allegations once dismissed as conspiracy theories were suddenly under formal review. And the woman, who had spent years clawing her way into the monarchy, now stood at the center of its greatest crisis. Public trust fractured. Polls plummeted. Camilla's name, once cautiously accepted, became radioactive. The palace issued no denials, only silence, colder than ever before. Insiders claimed a communications blackout had been ordered. Others hinted at private royal meetings, behind locked doors, desperate to assess the damage. But the damage was done. And as the world's eyes turned back to Rome, it became clear. The Pope had seen it coming. Not because he was political, but because he understood something far more dangerous than scandal. He understood the erosion of truth. His sermons, once ridiculed for being too vague, were now replayed like prophecy. Not all crowns shine with truth. Grace cannot be inherited, it must be earned. The world finally listened, and in doing so, his legacy shifted from spiritual shepherd to silent sentinel, a man who dared to draw a line when few others would. For Camilla, the fallout is still unfolding, but what lies ahead may not only redefine her reign, it could redefine the very meaning of monarchy. Because this was never just about a queen. It was about what the world allows to wear the crown. And as Queen Camilla faces the weight of history, one question remains. Was she warned or was she judged? Share your thoughts in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.